briefly, I just want to mention that the presentation this evening is drawn from my newest book that just came out a couple of months ago called Consuming the Word, the New Testament and the Eucharist in the Early Church. It picks up right where the Lamb's Supper leaves off, and it's really designed for ordinary Catholics as well as ex-Catholics who want to find out what the New Testament really teaches. And so if you've got family or friends and they have Christmas to celebrate, I want to propose that you might want to get them some resources to grow in this. I also wanted to mention a book that Chris and Carol have benefited from a lot called Living the Mysteries. He wanted to begin reading the early church fathers, and he went online and he realized it's going to cost him hundreds of dollars, several volumes. And I said, wait, I put together an anthology with my best friend Mike Aquilina of 50 days of readings from our favorite church fathers that draw from the old and show how it's fulfilled in the new in all of the sacraments. So I wanted to recommend Living the Mysteries, especially for those who want to discover the early church fathers and how they lead us into it. The best book that I have written for the new evangelization is a book called First Comes Love, Finding Your Family in the Church and the Trinity, where God is fathering us as his sons and daughters. I really want to recommend this to anybody who has family members who really have drifted away and wonder what's the point of just going back to all those rules and regulations. First Comes Love shows that the inner logic of our faith is not law but love. It isn't being an employee, it's being a beloved child of God. I also wanted to recommend this book called Covenant and Communion, the Biblical Theology of Pope Benedict. It isn't an easy breezy book for beginners, but if you've read other books, I'd encourage you to wake up to something that I discovered years ago, and that is we have never had a man occupy the chair of Peter like Pope Benedict. In 2,000 years, you can study, but you won't find anybody who is not only a world-class biblical and theological scholar, off the charts, respected by all, but someone who could make the Bible come alive like nobody since the Fathers. I found Ratzinger before I was even sure I'd end up becoming a Catholic. I devoured his stuff. When he became Pope Benedict, I wrote this book. For a good laugh, I sent it off to the largest evangelical Protestant publisher in the United States. I knew they'd turn it down, but at least one of them might read it. The editor-in-chief got it. After 2 or 3 people had read it, they loved it. They were like, we'll publish it, but we had no idea that your Pope could make the Bible come alive like this guy. And I'm like, Jim, there are Catholics out there who don't know that. He's like, well, we got to tell them. And I'm like, I would agree. I would agree. So while he's still with us, let's lay hold of his legacy that is being lived out so effectively and powerfully by Pope Francis, his successor. I also wanted to mention another book. This is not for beginners, but if you want to figure out what's happened to the Bible and why do people not believe it anymore? Why don't they preach it effectively? I wrote a book called Politicizing the Bible. It just came out a couple of months ago also. The roots of historical criticism and how Scripture was secularized from 1300 on. It's not easy breezy, but if you have that kind of academic interest, I'd really encourage you to do that. And finally, I'm not going to mention any more except this one. This is my personal favorite. I'd never been asked to write a book by an archbishop before. Chaput, then in Denver, said, we need a high school book. And I'm like, aren't there good ones out there? I'm a college prof. He's like, no, they're not. I looked around and sure enough, there wasn't. So I spent a year working on this book, 15 chapters of the Old Testament, 15 in the New, showing out all climaxes in the sacraments, especially the Mass. I sent it off, and then I waited a whole year, wondering, did they lose my manuscript? What happened? And then one day, without any warning, this book showed up in the mail. I'm like, what is this? My name wasn't on the cover, but I recognized the title, and I realized they had transformed this typed manuscript into the most beautiful book with all these maps, charts, and diagrams, and sacred art and photographs. I carried it around with me everywhere I went for the next 2 or 3 months. I got stopped downtown by this kid. What are you doing with our book? I'm like, what do you mean, your book? We're using it as a text at Catholic Central. I'm like, oh, that's great, but it's my book too. My name's not here, but I'll show you. I'm the author. And he looks at me, and he's like, that's cool. And I'm like, why is that cool? He said, because last week we were all saying, it's the first time the Bible has come alive, and our faith makes sense. It's exciting. And I'm like, that is cool. You just made my year. It's now in almost 40% of the Catholic high schools, but it's also in colleges and adult education. So if you're open to really going deeper into the Bible, as Catholics, I'd really encourage you to look at this resource because it really is a way. And Archbishop Chaput was very kind to write a very glowing foreword as well.